Jeff, you up?
All right. Welcome, everyone. This is Your Bytes, Your Rights. We are a live weekly discussion and podcast about data ownership, digital rights, and your privacy. In episode 27, we talk about privacy agents and double agents. Who can you trust in the privacy agent ecosystem? And for maybe a lot of you, what the hell is a privacy agent? I'm Jeff Jokish, founder of Privacy Plan and a vocal data privacy researcher. I live at the intersection of privacy and data about data privacy. I'm here with my co-host, Christian Kmeyer, managing partner at Sustany Capital. Chris runs a VC fund that focuses on blockchain tech, and he's into privacy, identity, the future of money, and central bank digital currencies. Say hi to the audience, Chris.
Hey, and whenever something goes technically wrong, that's currently always my fault. Today we are running episode 27, and maybe this will be the first time when I don't mess up. Let's see.
Yeah, I thought the last episode was good. We had a few technical glitches, so we're getting there. We've also got with us hopefully two guests, one at the moment, hopefully two at any moment. Right now we have Carrie Lenning from Castle Bridge, so I'm going to let her introduce herself. But Carrie's a well-known privacy pro, and like me, she's been investigating this space for what I call privacy agents. Tell the audience a little bit about yourself and your background, Carrie.
Thanks, Jeff. Wow, well known is good. It means I'm getting out there in the world. So I've been in the privacy space for a number of years now. I work for a small company, advisory consulting service here in Dublin, Ireland. So I'm and I focus on a lot of different things, but the privacy agent space is really kind of fascinating. I wrote a little bit about some of the early tools that were coming out, and I think that's how Jeff and I started. One of the ways Jeff and I started chatting about things was discovering, how these tools work and how they affect data subjects, and both good and bad.
Nice. Well, apparently our other guest, Lawrence, is on, but we can't see him on the panel. Oh, there he is. Sorry, I had my screen a little closed. So Lawrence is here. So our second guest is Lawrence. Is it Gentilio? Am I pronouncing that right?
Close, Gentilello.
All right. Well, excellent. Well, Lawrence is the CEO of Optory, and Optory is one of these privacy agents we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to let him introduce you to himself as well as his company. So say a few words, Lawrence.
Yeah, hi. Nice to meet everybody. Lawrence Gentilello, CEO and founder at Optory. Optory is a privacy agent. We're a data privacy company that specializes in removing consumers from data brokers, in particular people search engines. So if you're Googled your own name or DuckDuckGo'd your name or Bing'd your own name, and you see these results in the search listings of somebody's home address, phone number, email, there's about 220 or so of those companies that we track and cover with our service, and we remove people from those sites. We started Optory about 2 years ago. We launched to the public last year. We service both consumers and businesses. And one of the things that's unique about Optory compared to other services that are out there is we have a very powerful search engine, which is sort of non-intuitive for most people when they think about the type of work that we do. So our search engine is very, very good at first locating people's profiles to see where they are. And then we have an approach that we use, which is basically humans plus machines. So we have automated opt-out processing that submits and manages opt-outs. But we also have a team of privacy agents that go through and smooth out the edges and ensure that every last thing is removed, because it's very difficult to remove people from the number of sites that we remove from. But very happy to be here and excited for the conversation. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We'll want to dig more into your specific product, but I want to back up a little bit first and sort of give the audience, I guess, a little bit of a primer on this subject, because I'm sure a lot of them don't really understand the landscape here. So to understand a little bit um, about why we're here, privacy laws are giving consumers more rights. Rights to access their data, rights to delete their data, rights to opt out of tracking and the sale of data. But exercising these rights can be hard. Why is that, right? Well, the data collection isn't always obvious. Consent is not always clear. Um, and it happens so frequently that opting out or deleting your data from lots of places could take months, even years, if you were to try to go to all these different places, some of the ones Lawrence is talking about, right? As well, the process for doing that can be extremely cumbersome, aggravating, even broken for some of these organizations. And who has your data? Do you even know? It's not always clear, especially in the case of data brokers, right? Third parties that you have no connection to. You wouldn't even know they had your data, for instance, right? But they're profiting from the sale of that data. So this new industry has arisen, companies hoping to help consumers automate these requests, right? The privacy community refers to these as data subject access requests, or DSARs. And DSARs sort of commonly refer to any of those flavors of access, delete, modify, opt out. But that's sort of the overall. But when we start to look at these privacy agents, the question has sort of arisen in the community as these services have popped up over the last couple of years is, what is the real value equation? Where do they sort of fit in the regulatory and legal framework? Because the laws that are sort of enabling them aren't necessarily really defining them particularly well, right? And so consumers are like, well, how is this supposed to work? And the companies that are receiving the requests aren't necessarily sure how they're supposed to process those requests, right? Are they legally binding? Who's actually representing, these customers? And so those are some of the issues that we want to sort of talk through here, as well as, the actual ins and outs of the products, like Lawrence's product, which I think is a really damn fine product, by the way. So let's dig into a little of that. Do you want to talk a little bit about this, Carrie?
Yeah, sure. I think it's an interesting. You brought a lot of things up that could potentially be talked about here. I think that there is definitely a growing market for this. Maybe sometimes good and sometimes bad. I'm personally a little skeptical, although I find a lot of these tools to be very interesting. And I've chatted with a lot of folks that are in the space, particularly in the subject access and deletion space. So it's maybe a little important to back up and actually talk a little bit about what data subject rights actually are. And in most cases, we're talking about what you mentioned, Jeff, access, rectification, changing things that are in error, deletion, modification of data, but also, opting out, objection to different kinds of processing, and then, making decisions around, how your data is being used past what you have maybe consented to in the past. And I think that what's really fascinating about the privacy agent space is that it's kind of leveraging, like you said, this kind of middle area where the law hasn't really well developed what these things are, what these tools are necessarily for. But they do see a market need there. It's interesting. It made me think of, in the GDPR, which is, I'm based in Ireland, so that's where my love and affection comes to. But I think in other laws as well in California, there is the idea of having representation or rights by third parties to represent a data subject. And I think a lot of companies have leveraged that to kind of market themselves as advocates on behalf of data subjects. And it's a neat idea. Like I'm a big fan of like what Optory is doing and what some of the other tools are doing. In principle, I just kind of am moderately a little skeptical of their degrees of effectiveness. I've used some of these tools in the past, and I and I've also done the thing where I do the Google search on myself and actually like try to reach out to all the different data brokers and try to manually opt out. And both have varying degrees of success, and I don't know which one is more successful.
Yeah, I think that's Lawrence's topic, right? Lawrence, maybe you wanna start for everybody to narrowly define how you understand a privacy agent.
Yeah, what's interesting is there's sort of these kind of like the more kind of academic and research perspective. And that was the perspective that I had when we were planning to launch Optory. And we were reading through word by word the CCPA, like the legal text, going through it word by word. I'm based in California. By the way, Optory is only works in the United States. So anybody can sign up, but if you sign up in a different country, we just say, we can't help you. We'll let you know when and if we cover your country. So we're United States only. And we're headquartered in California, which is where I live. I'm in the Bay Area. And when I started off, I actually came from Accenture. The other thing a little bit about my background that might be interesting for people to understand, and the background of the co-founders of Optory, is some of you might not like this, but I actually spent close to 10 years in the data broker space. One of my co-founders was the chief architect of a very large data broker as well, a very early person there. I worked at Blue Kai, which was one of the early cookie data warehouses. We were bought by Oracle. I was the lead product manager at Oracle for the Oracle Audience Data Management Platform. And then I led Accenture's data management platforms practice for about 3.5 years. And so at Accenture, it's a consulting, you spend a lot of time researching things. And so I became fascinated with the privacy implications. This kind of goes back to how Optory was started. Was I was on the other side and seeing this world where any data that a company can get their hands on, they can leverage, use, and profit from. And I became very, very excited when these laws started to get passed that were giving consumers these rights that they never have had before. And unfortunately, in the United States, that they still don't have. There's most people in the United States, to travesty, literally do not have the right to opt out. But we could see the writing on the wall that was going to change, and it's changing, and hopefully it'll change quicker. And so back to sort of like the role of the privacy agent, there's kind of this perspective, kind of a research perspective. And when we first started, we were really hung up on like, well, how do you submit these like ironclad, like, airtight DSAR requests backed by, power of attorney, that kind of thing. And then when we got into the other side, which is in practice, going out in the field and signing up for customers and creating the product and submitting the opt-outs. Today we cover 220 data brokers. When we started, we covered 10, and we were submitting opt-outs for friends and family members. And the data brokers that we cover, we start really with people search sites, and we've moved on to B2B like lead databases, and they have opt-out pages, and we submit opt-outs to them. And so we submit opt-outs to them, and we get profiles removed. And so we're rapidly expanding our coverage. And there's kind of two different types of data brokers: those that just honor and respect opt-out requests, and those that don't. And so we have on our roadmap additional product functionality to address those that currently don't. But the last thing I'll say is that it's really easy kind of from the outside to think of it as kind of like a simple answer, a simple solution. Humans love simplicity. Is somebody good or bad? Are they evil or are they not evil? Does the product work or it doesn't? Our business is one of tremendous complexity. Dealing with data brokers that have billions and billions of profiles and billions of pages indexed in Google, and hundreds of data brokers, and submitting options. Everyone's a little bit different. what works with data broker A might not work with data broker B. We have a lot of different methodologies that we use for different data brokers, and we're we're productizing new features to increase our coverage. So I'll pause there. We could go deeper into any of that, but it might be a good place to start.
I have dozens of questions already at this point in time. But maybe we should go through this by first principles. So maybe for the audience, tell people why they should reach out to you, i.e. like why do people reach out to you usually? You probably have a good idea at this point in time why people are bothered by the fact that there's profiles about them around there. Maybe you can make some of these examples for people to understand why they might want to think about it.
Yeah, well, one thing that's important to understand is that privacy is a very multifaceted problem, and it takes a multifaceted approach. And so, a classic thing is sometimes we get people that say, "Oh, I don't need Optery because I use a VPN," or I don't need Optery, I use DuckDuckGo. Okay, so now your searches are not going to be revealed to Google; they will be private. But if you search for your name, you might still see results from Instant Checkmate and White Pages and Spokio and Been Verified and Social Catfish. Using DuckDuckGo is not going to remove your profiles from those websites. And using a VPN, fantastic, but that's not going to stop targeted ads. So it's a very multifaceted problem. But to your question, why does somebody use something like us? Is if you want to tackle this problem of, I don't want to be in these data brokers' databases. I don't want to be. I want to be opted out. I want to be removed from the data brokers. The other thing is what types of companies do you want to be opted out of? Do you want to be opted out of personalized ads? Do you want to get opted out of the DSPs, SSPs, the whole ad tech ecosystem? Well, then you have a certain set of tools that you would use for that. Do you want to opt yourself out of something else? We remove people from data brokers. We're not focused on Facebook. We're not focused on Google. We got people say, "Can you delete my LinkedIn account?" We would recommend to Google that. How do I delete my LinkedIn account? And go delete it. We're going to remove you from the stuff that, who are these people? Who is this company? That's them.com that's posting my IP address online. Can you help me with that? That's when people come to us.
Yeah, I wanted to add something there. So when I put together my data set that I posted a link to, and noticed a couple of people jumped on it. One of the things that's actually not in that data set that I have in my sort of master file is who each of these sort of privacy agents targets. And that is one of the sort of big sort of differentiators between some of these things. And maybe I'll add that to the public data set. But some of these sort of different services will say that they're targeting data brokers, and some will say that they're sort of targeting big tech, and some will say they're targeting both, and that there are a few other sort of tweaks in there, right? But I think that's sort of an important distinction, because data brokers are I think maybe a bigger threat. And it's relatively easy, at least for some of the big tech platforms, to opt out yourself out of those platforms. It may not be technically easy, right? But you can do it. And there's only relatively few of those compared to the number of data brokers out there, right? We could sort of talk about the number of data brokers. It's hard to even define how many of those there are. But I think it's an interesting distinction. Another sort of point there maybe to make is that when I sort of look at this privacy agent ecosystem, I see a little bit of variation. Most of the agents that I originally focused on were agents that focused on the delete process. And I think that is the clearest value equation, right? And that's where Optery is, and that's where several of the other ones are that I think bring the most value to the market. There are others that try to help you sort of control your data and maybe maybe those are some of the ones that want to help you control what you give to certain brands and brands and maybe big tech, and maybe control what ads you see. I think eventually that might really be a pretty cool proposition, but it's a little bit harder to understand right now, right? And there are companies like mine, I think, that are doing that. And I'm not saying anything bad about them. I think it's just a little bit more of a complex value equation right now. And then there are companies that are actually trying to help consumers monetize their data. And I think that's pretty interesting as well, but also a lot more complicated. And right now, there's a lot of players, I think, in that space that I would be very careful about getting in bed with. And I haven't even listed those in this data set for that reason.
I would love to know those companies, honestly. I think that's kind of a fascinating, that's a fascinating group right there, because Jeff and I have had many conversations about data ownership, and so he knows where I stand on that, and I'm not usually a fan. Yeah, these are very interesting points, and there is a huge ecosystem. Your database is amazing, by the way, Jeff. So I just wanted to give that shout out.
No, thanks.
Yeah, so we're working long term on making this available to everybody to kind of identify systemic risks and report on that, because Jeff, how many companies are in there now? It's like 1,600 or more.
Oh, in the data broker database is actually over 2,000 now.
Okay, yeah. So Lawrence, you're addressing 200 at the moment. So is your objective to ultimately go to like 2,000?
Yeah, when we launched, we had about 100, and then we had 150, we had 200, 220. The other thing that's interesting is some of those, we're focused on the ones in the United States, and there's a number of different categories. The way we kind of categorize data brokers is people search sites is one category, white pages, Spokio, etc. The next category that we identify is the B2B contact databases. That's like ZoomInfo, Clearbit, LeadIQ, RocketReach, Apollo, those folks. And then the next category is basically the credit ratings agencies. They're big data brokers. And the next category after that, we refer to as consumer businesses with consumer brands with data broker businesses, like TiVo, Albertsons, Roku, folks like that basically have, Visa, MasterCard, have large consumer businesses, and then on the background are selling data about their consumers. And then, there's also another category, is mostly sort of like offline stuff, like direct mail, that kind of thing. So we very consciously started with the people search site category, and now we have moved into the B2B contact database category. But if maybe your list, I don't know how you have that broken down into different subcategories, we're moving kind of category by category very consciously.
Yeah. I think the 2,000 that I have are probably, well, they're categorized a little bit differently, and it may be a little bit wider than those 5 categories, but it's interesting, and I think it would probably expand your list a little bit. But I like the breakdown that you gave there. That's an interesting taxonomy.
Actually, the one other category I skipped over that I forgot, and I don't know why I skipped over, but is the space that I came from, which I refer to as the profile data brokers. So the big names there are Oracle Data Cloud, Newstar, Nielsen, Axiom, Epsilon. So Oracle Data Cloud isn't going to be posting up your home address and phone number and search engines, whereas Spokio, White Pages will. So that's the other big category. And
they do
there's
sell the
probably
data,
a bunch
though.
of companies in this on your list that we don't cover yet.
Those companies do sell the data, though. Axiom in particular, and all these kind of larger data, what I like to call data vampires more than data brokers. But the larger data vampire companies do in fact sell all the data. So even though they don't make it publicly available, they are they are sharing this. And I'm, is the plan then for Optory to go start targeting those, or is that a little too?
Absolutely. No, they absolutely sell data. Oracle's like $1 billion data sales business. Um,
Did you say a
we just
billion?
we
Or
haven't tackled that category yet.
yeah.
But is it on a roadmap? Absolutely.
Did you say Oracle makes $1 billion on that?
I don't know the exact numbers. It's it's quite a large business.
Jeff, note to self, we should have a table like how much revenue, like by company, how much revenue is being made on.
I've actually got revenue
that.
stats in my data broker database,
It-
but it's not, it doesn't know how much is actually from the data broker business.
Okay, yeah, let's try to break this out and publish a monthly statistic of the top 10, so people get some awareness around how big this problem is. And the way I think about this is to inject some technical things here is, in my mind, all of these companies are in some shape or form criminal entities. And so what I mean by that is I think they all host some form of data that violates someone's right. And they had a specific thought, because you were saying, Lawrence, that you're addressing the United States specifically. So what does that mean in terms of some data broker in the United States having information about a European, for example, in their data set? Is that someone who could then come to you and ask for the data to be removed, or are you just serving then United States citizens or people who live in the United States?
And how do you know?
Yeah. When somebody when somebody signs up for Optory, we have some minimum information that we need, without which we could not serve you. So that's your first name, your last name, your current city, current state, and your year of birth. Without that information, we can't remove you. So it doesn't even make sense to sign up if you're not comfortable giving that.
What
So-
if I just lie though? Like, I lived in California and I have addresses in Virginia. I lived in Washington, D.C. I've lived all over the place in the States. I mean, you can tell I'm American. Um, like, and all those people sites, partly you're using that information, at least the location information, to do the verification of the individual, to match Carrie Lenning in Virginia compared to Carrie Lenning in Kansas. But there's nothing that necessarily stops me from just adding the fact that I lived in the United States and the specific places that I lived, right?
Yeah, most of the tens of thousands of people that have signed up and use Optory are just sort of full-time in the United States. But we do have kind of like edge cases of folks who are expats and they used to live in the United States, but now they live in Hong Kong, and they have signed up and used us because they still have some remnant profiles that are floating around from when they lived in the US, or someone who might have been born and raised in France, but then they even may have come over to the United States for a handful of years for school and for work, and then they moved back, and then they still have these remnant profiles floating around the United States, even though they're back in Europe. So there's those sort of edge cases. You just can't, if you sign up to use an address in Ireland, nothing's going to happen. We'll just give you a notice that says, we don't support your country. But
right.
If
Partly that's because Europe actually has privacy laws. But, in the United States, you have a market, right? You have these data vampires to go after. There's very few, with the exception of, say, the UK. There's some countries in Asia, obviously, that don't have the same robust laws. In other parts of the world, I'm sure you could have a thriving market in Russia, for example. But, I'm assuming the reason you target the United States is that there's, as Jeff mentioned, over 2,000 different data brokers, or at least 2,000 different websites, promoting themselves as data brokers. Some of them, of course, are owned by the same sets of companies and things like that. Whereas in Europe, it's a lot harder. I do searches of myself all the time. I never find anything that I don't want to find floating around in Europe, because the data broker economy just doesn't exist, because we have laws. and that's the thing. My question to you is, what are you guys going to do when a national data privacy law comes into place, and then it kind of starts to actually have an effect on data brokers? Will you still have a business?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's a lot of reasons that we're not in Europe right now, and one of them is because the GDPR does a lot of the work for consumers that they don't need to use a service. One of the things that was surprising, though, for us is how many European citizens reach out to us and say, "We really want this. Let us know it's available." That was surprising. It happens all the time. But to answer your question, I hope that we get a national federal data privacy law soon. But we haven't had one for quite a while. I mean, this has been rattling around for 10 years. And even
longer than that.
Yeah, longer than that. I feel like it started to hit the public consciousness in kind of like 2011, 12, 13, about 10 years ago, and we still don't have one. I think we're closer than we ever have been before. The American Data Privacy and Protection Act, it has some language that not only requires a registry, which is what we have here in California, but also has a centralized opt-out mechanism. So if and when that law gets enacted, and if and when that language stays, that will be very interesting to see what happens with that. I am a little bit skeptical that the government would be able to operate a large-scale consent management platform, which is essentially what that is. But we'll see.
They have the TCPA. That there is the telecommunications opt-out for not getting spam calls anymore. Whether or not it's effectively run is an interesting question, because it's certainly being ignored largely now. But it has been in effect since 2014. Jeff, you might know that number better than me.
That sounds right. But I still
Yeah.
get spam.
Yeah, you still got the spam from the people from India and other people who don't actually follow U.S. jurisdictional law. But yeah, it does exist. The U.S. can do it. The FTC could do it. It's just whether or not there's enough willpower.
Yeah.
I don't really think, though, that even if we pass some data broker laws, I would hope it would get rid of the problem, but I don't think it does. I mean, even with GDPR in Europe, one of the other privacy agents that I'm familiar with, Incogni, they're almost entirely in Europe right now, and they focus entirely on data brokers and doing pretty well by all accounts, right? So, I think that even if we were to pass ADPPA, it seems to me like Lawrence and Optery are still going to have lots of information to go after, because I think those search results that people don't want on the web are still going to be floating around up there for quite a while.
Yeah, I think partially the reason why these things haven't become mainstream and haven't gotten a lot of attention is because of a branding issue. As in, like, privacy is something that people kind of check off when they join the platform, and that's why it's kind of boring to talk about. And I think it also kind of underestimates the actual problem that we're facing, because it really has to do with freedom, right? It's really the right to self-determination, because people keep saying things like data brokers, so they focus on the data. The data itself has no value, right? So what has value is refactoring the data in a way that it can influence a person's behavior to make a certain decision. So ultimately, it's always the same. People are using it to offer social engineering as a service solutions, and that's the way that revenue is being created using quote-unquote data. And so the larger point, there is another call to action. Let's come up with something that's more sexy than that. So, and actually rebrand those people and rebrand the effort that we're going for, which again, loosely defined as human agency, human freedom, and obviously that's not sexy, and I'm not the best branding guy here, But I think that's an important thing to change in the messaging, to really make clear that the people that are doing this, they're criminals. It doesn't matter if you call them advertisers, in my opinion. To me, they're just criminals. If you're messing with human agency, if you're diverting people's attention, if you're stealing their time, you're a criminal. That's no different from stealing their money, stealing anything else.
Data vampire, come on, own it,
Data
own it. That's what we call it in the privacy community. Data vampires. Own it.
I haven't heard that before you mentioned that, so but we can try to make that a thing. So totally for that. Let's create a mascot that goes along with that and start branding that. I kind of like a subset of that we stumbled across in a previous discussion, calling the depositories of those being infected by toxic data. I think that's kind of a useful term because to me, this data is toxic if and where it's inflicted by someone else's, or it's affecting someone else's legal rights, which I think is true 100% of the time. And then one last thing, and that's more, again, somewhat of a call to action of our daily work here. It's important to understand that making these changes are not optional if we want to live in free societies, right? Because now we are basically at a crossroads to where we're creating technologies that make it trivial for anybody, right? So for literally anybody to de-anonymize a person and start influencing their behavior, not only large-scale quote-unquote advertisers, but then also obviously governments or your neighbor or anybody else. And that's definitely not a healthy scenario if we want to live in free societies where this can happen, where anybody can profile you for any reason and just simply get whatever 4,000 data points on you, right? So to that extent, it's always important to understand that Google is not a search engine, Facebook is not a social media company, right? So they are definitely something else. You should just simply work backwards from how are these people deriving revenue, but be specific about that, right? Don't let them get away with the idea as how do you make money in the typical quote from Mark Zuckerberg in Congress. We said advertising. No, that's not what you're doing, right? That's definitely not what you're doing. Call it what it is. That's the first step, right? If you want to address a problem, you actually have to put the right label on that. Don't call it something else.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's pretty obvious that privacy agents are trying to help get rid of a lot of this toxic data, this personal data that's floating around. But there is some question about whether all of these services are providing a lot of value. One of the concerns that I've always had is, okay, so I pay one of these agents to delete a lot of my data. Is it not back in a year or 2 years, or isn't it just recollected and redistributed? Because copies of data and copies, it doesn't just like reappear eventually, quickly or slowly. Maybe both of you would want to take a shot at answering that, Lawrence and Carrie.
Yeah, I mean, I think that someone asked in the comments, how do you know if they actually delete it? Now, I'm a deeply skeptical human being that trusts no one. So my answer is I don't trust anything that they say that they do, and I check. It's a verification thing. So every 6 months or so, I do a Google dork search of myself, and I try to find everything that's out there, and then I go on these sites like that allow for some of the data agents or privacy agents, to their credit, I think, offer a free search, right, where they will do the searching and at least find, because they have connections to, I don't know if it's API calls or however you guys are doing it, but they have connections to things that Google is not necessarily going to find from the data agents. And then that gives me an indicator. I'm a dork, and I keep a spreadsheet, and I have shared it with Jeff, so Jeff knows that I'm also a dork. And the spreadsheet informs me of a couple of things. One, it lets me keep track of, which companies are most likely to actually follow an opt-out request and which ones aren't. But then it also allows me to go back and say, okay, 6 months from now when I do my Google dork search of myself again, where has my information popped up again? And I suspect that, the answer is that, most of these companies don't ever really delete your data, in part because most of them are just sharing data amongst themselves, and so they repopulate the information. It's all probably very automated. It's all probably very much just like, someone, InfoPay sends a query to, what's the other one? Oh, Jet, help me out. InfoPay sends a query to to Solo Source. That's another one. Or Spy Dialer Inc. And then they share information amongst one another. And then, of course, their sub sites all populate the same information. So finding the parent, finding the head of the Hydra to cut that off is important. But otherwise, I don't think that you never really do find out if the data is actually deleted unless you just keep looking.
Yeah, there's. I want to make one point there to sort of expand on what you're saying, Carrie. So when you look at the data brokers, a lot of these companies, these data brokers have multiple domains and sub brands, and it's hard to tell who's connected to who. Often it's obfuscated. And one of the things that we wanted to sort of bring up here is the fact that it does appear that there's, if not close connections, at least tenuous connections between a few of these privacy agents and data brokers. So that maybe some of them are actually collecting your data and making money off that, and then perhaps charging you as a privacy agent to then delete your data. I don't want to call anyone out specifically here, but I do think that that's happening at least in a couple of instances.
It's the revenge porn model. This is exactly what happened. You laugh, but I'm serious. I'm dead serious. The revenge porn model back in the mid 2000s, it was all these complete and total scums of humanity putting up porn and things of an unconsensual porn, basically, of ex-girlfriends and things like that. And then they turned around and came up with a whole new company that said, oh, we can remove the revenge porn. We'll do that for you if you pay us $30 a month. And it would go away, and then when you stopped paying the $30 a month, magically it would pop right back up on the revenge porn sites. Yes.
So Lawrence, is there a follow-up then when people subscribe to Optery? So are you, as your company, checking back if these entries are reappearing?
Yeah. So let me provide some thoughts. So first off, there's a couple dozen privacy agents like Optery, but not all are created equal, and I think that's partly where we're headed here. When we looked at the space, one of the things that we were kind of really surprised by was how bad most of the solutions in the space were. The biggest name, when we started, covered about 40 data brokers with their plan. And now they cover maybe about 50 to 60. Most of the companies in the space cover 40, 50, 60, maybe 100 data brokers. And we were really surprised by that. We thought that was pretty bad. So the process, Carrie, that you just described of Googling your name every few months, we've automated that. So whenever people are looking at different solutions out there, the first thing I say is almost every company in the space offers a free scan. Narrow your choices down to a few companies and do the free scan and look at the results. That's going to give you a really good indicator of how good their technology is. And that's really where Optery shines. On average, we find about 95 exposed profiles on the web when an average user signs up. Sometimes we see as many as 120 exposed profiles. We often get people who are really dedicated privacy enthusiasts who feel like they've got it all figured out. They sign up for an Optery account, and we find another 10 or 20 profiles. On average, when people come over from our competitors, we find 20 to 40 profiles that our competitors have missed. Happens all the time. So what we do is if somebody signs up for free, we immediately do a scan, get a report within 24 hours, and screenshots. Screenshots, you can see exactly where it is. PCMag recently did a series of reviews on the companies in our space, and they named Optry their editor's choice as the most outstanding product in the category. And they really, really highlighted the live screenshots and live proof evidence of what was happening. So for our paying customers, every month we go out and we rescan and we re-opt out because the profiles do pop back up. And they pop back up for different reasons. One, again, every data broker is a little bit different. Two, technically, most citizens of the United States have no right to opt out. So technically, they can add you back whenever they want. And thirdly is they're not perfect. They have a lot of different data sets. They're crawling the web. They're buying data sets. They're importing public records databases. And they state when you submit an opt-out to them on their confirmation screens, a lot of them will say, please check back in a few months. Sometimes we accidentally add you back. And they do. In the California Consumer Privacy Act and the CPRA, one of the things that's really interesting in the law is it says that companies must honor the opt-out for a minimum of 12 months, which means by law, after 12 months, they can add you back legally, even in California, where we have, ostensibly the strictest law in the United States. So do they add you back? Absolutely. We see it starting to happen after around 6 months, 6, 9, 12 months, and every data broker is different. Some of them, when you opt out, they will honor that sort of indefinitely. Others, it's going to come back in a few months.
Yeah. Let me ask something that's somewhat specific. We don't have to geek out all that much on that. So my understanding is there are certain provisions in specifically the California Privacy Rights Act, and there's other states that are about to pass a very similar legislation here. But one of the things that stood out in my understanding is there's a very narrow legal reason for that, is that these companies have to provide you with the information of how much your data is worth, right? Specifically in California. Is that a question that you ask? And the reason for that, for people as a background, is one of the issues typically is if there is damages, if you think you have been damaged by this information, then you typically have to provide evidence for this damage, which oftentimes is complicated. And so by simply having the value of your data, it gives you standing in court. And I'm simplifying it probably massively to a degree that it is false, so please don't troll me with that. I know that I tend to know that, but I'm interested to hear if that's information that you provide to people in California specifically or in general.
No, I'm not very familiar with that concept of what you described, unfortunately.
Okay. How about any other legal remedies? Like, do you create a trail of evidence in essence for users that could be actionable? As in, yes, they had opted out, and within 3 months they're back in, and they want to hire a lawyer to go after them? Or?
Well, I think certainly, for our, when somebody creates a free Optry account, you get your reports, and you've got that in your account, and we have screenshots. If you go, so I suppose if someone wanted to use our reports, we also send out before and after reports. So sort of say, here's your screenshot. There you were before. There you're not there. We actually have a patent on deep linking into the data brokers, and so actually you can click on the screenshot and go right to the page. I suppose if someone wanted to bring a suit against data brokers, they could sort of say, hey, here's my paper trail of here my profile was, and it was removed, and then it was added back, and it was only 3 months later or 6 months later. Certainly, I suppose people could use that. We hadn't really thought about that, to be honest, but I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, I think there should be a marketplace. So in the sense of for law firms that have access to repeat violators, so they can then start preparing class action lawsuits against those people. Because the problems we created kind of a digital landfill of personally identifiable data out there, and it's not going to go away. That's just utopian, right? This whole idea of GDPR and the right to be forgotten from a technology perspective is naive, right? Nothing that you digitally observe will ever be forgotten. That's just nonsense, right? So from a technical perspective. But the correct request, in my personal opinion, is you, as a human being, you have the unalienable right not to be observed. Because even observation and the knowledge that they're being observed is changing behavior, right? And that observation.
But observability comes with findability as well. Like, I don't necessarily, I mean, I agree with you in the strictest technical sense that deleting is hard. I think that's what you're kind of getting at with the technical level of, you'll never be forgotten. But at the same time, to its credit, Google does a fairly good job honoring RTBF requests. And it's surprisingly challenging to try to find things that have been forgotten, at least in Europe. If you know where to look, if you're determined enough, of course, that's true. But most people don't spend the resources and the time and the energy to try to, find information about, say, Mr. Conseillas, where where that case originated from in Spain. They don't look for that sort of a thing. So I'm not totally sure I agree with you that right to be forgotten is not really a thing.
Well, no, what I'm saying is that the request is naive. It doesn't go far enough, right? You first have to acknowledge the fact that as a human being, you have the right not to be observed. And this is kind of after the fact already, right? This must be default.
But privacy has multiple concepts, right? Like Daniel Solove, who's an academic in this space and is brilliant, by the way, and if anyone who hasn't read him should absolutely read him, talks about different kinds of conceptions of privacy. The right to not be observed is absolutely correct. You're right, but there's also rights to solitude. There's rights to be forgotten. There's rights to partner intimacy. There's rights to all sorts of things. So it's and if you want to be a capitalist about it, there's the right to be able to control how you monetize your data.
Yeah, well, yeah, and we looked at a lot of schemas like that. By and large, I think they're all nonsense. Ultimately, people don't want that because, by and large, as an individual, your data is not worth anything to to anybody, right? It's pennies, if that at all, right? They're only worth something in aggregate, and in as much as I can aggregate additional data to influence your behavior, they're valuable. Otherwise, they're not actually valuable, with few exceptions, right? If you have particular unique traits that lend themselves to a certain analysis, i.e. in the medical space, that's a different story. But these are the exceptions that prove the rule. But the larger point there is, and you touched on that a little bit, is what we need is anonymity, right? Not privacy, but actual anonymity by default. Kind of the way it almost kind of used to be before the introduction of digital solutions, because that's the reason why things are changing, why we live in free societies. We touched on these discussions last week in the context of this very unfortunate OFAC action. The fact simply that you cannot speak or that you cannot speak with anonymity has a chilling effect, right? So that there wouldn't be a United States today if in this particular case, right? So King George would have just sent his assassins after Hamilton and the others that published the Federalist Papers and so forth, because they would have been de-anonymized, profiled, and he would have sent his killers after them if he knew that these were the people behind the independence movement. At least that's my thesis.
Well, I wanted to try to get to one other piece of this, guys. If we look at data subject access rights, I think that we have to think about where is this going for privacy professionals who have to implement this. Optery and to some extent some of the other privacy agents we talked about, I mentioned Incogni, focus on data brokers. But there are other privacy agents, I won't name any particular names, but that are also targeting brands and just regular companies, right? And they're saying,
I will. Privacy be mine. few of the other ones out there.
Yeah.
I'll name them because we get spam from them all the time.
So
Yeah.
they're
Sorry.
doing that. They're sending out DSAR requests in droves, right? So a company might get 10 or 50 or 1,000 DSAR requests from mine or from Privacy Bee, right? And what's a privacy professional to do, Carrie? How should they respond to these?
Well, normally what a lot of us have been chatting about this. I could speak for hours about this particular problem because this is a problem. These are unsophisticated tools in a lot of cases when they're used against just generic processors of data. Sometimes someone will sign up for an email or sign up for a newsletter or express some interest, and there's a thing in their inbox that comes from Twilio or some other company, Castlebridge. That doesn't mean we're processing or doing anything with their data at that point. It could have been from years ago. A lot of times what we end up doing as privacy professionals is that we push back. We say, look, we're not going to play your game. We want to speak directly to the data subject, which is completely right, and it's a sound position. Privacy agency is fine, or your privacy agents are fine if they are being targeted. Like I have less of a problem with folks going after the data brokers, but when they're just going after any old processor of data, it becomes problematic because most of the time they are not necessarily targeting the right people. They should be targeting the controllers of the data, not necessarily someone who's, if they're getting a message sent from MailChimp. MailChimp is not necessarily really in control of the data. They can't do anything to effectuate what the data subject actually wants in the first place, which is to have their data removed or to have access to their data. It's not in the law, for one, but it's also just deeply problematic from a response thing because these things are sent off very automatically and very just kind of massively without any thought.
So we don't really have time to fully sort of address this, but yeah. I agree with you for the most part. But I want to make sure that people realize that I think things are going to change at some point because the laws are going to get clarified, and maybe they're going to get clarified in favor of companies so that they don't have to respond to those kinds of requests. But ultimately, I think things are going to have to change so that there's not this conflict or ambiguity in this situation, right? And one thing that I posted a link in the chat where this Consumer Reports Digital Lab is working on a project called the Data Rights Protocol, which is essentially an API that they're trying to get members of sort of the whole ecosystem to join in together on that would essentially be sort of a framework where all parties could sort of agree on a common methodology for submitting DSAR requests so that there wouldn't have to be any ambiguity of how to do identification of the data subject or how that might have to work so that even orgs like Privacy Bee could potentially do these kinds of requests in the right way, and any org that subscribed to that framework could process them without having to be overburdened, right?
I mean, that doesn't get solved by a protocol, Jeff. That gets solved by like some intelligence. It gets solved by not just scanning email addresses for every time you get a message sent from MailChimp.
Right.
It's a very straightforward. I mean, in the law, it's very straightforward. Subject access requests or deletion requests or any other kinds of requests are very simple. It's the subject says, I would like you to provide me information about my data, the information you have about me. Here's my information, and the responding party needs to ask only for the verification of information that they actually collect. Can't ask for more information, can't ask for driver's license if you don't actually collect driver's license information, or photos if you don't collect photos. You need to tie it to the actual data that's being collected. It is a straightforward process. What's problematic is that when you try to automate everything, that fails because there's no sophistication, there's no nuance in what you're sending a request to. That's where the problem is.
Yeah, so there was just a good article on particularly this topic in the New York Times very recently with a very interesting case. So someone who was actually working in that field, interesting enough, took a picture of his son in a particular state and sent it, and Google, so it won't spoil the plot here, Google shut down his account and reported him to the police, and he lost access to everything. And you're nodding because you probably read the case, but so that was kind of one of those false positives, and so it caused a lot of havoc for him because he lost access, unfortunately, to all his pictures and otherwise accounts, and still hasn't gotten it back, even though he was exonerated by the investigative units that were alerted by Google in this particular case. And so that's the problem when you assume that everybody is essentially a criminal and that you need to observe everybody and report them. Just kind of like the same issue with all your financial transactions, where the state kind of makes the assumption that everybody's a criminal, so we need to constantly monitor that, and then you multiply that problem by deputizing private companies for that. So this way you kind of work around the fact that you usually need a warrant to do that, but we just observed you already, so we can do this kind of after the fact. We established that, and I think we should insist on that. It doesn't matter if it's the government or private company, you need a warrant. You need some reasonable requirement here that is supported by some form of due process in order to start profiling me in any shape or form. Advertising as a business model doesn't deserve to, if we want to call it that, doesn't deserve the protection that we're giving it, in my opinion. That's not a valid business model in my mind, specifically in the context of digital solutions. Anyway, sorry for the kind of top of the hour rant again. I tend to do these things since I'm very concerned about this particular direction, have been for a long time. Jeff, what are we going to talk about next week?
We're going to actually talk about the Twitter security debacle next week.
So if you have an opinion or resources on that, let us know. We invite you to the show. This was Your Bytes, Your Rights, episode 27. Join our group. Join us again next Friday. Jeff and I will be doing this until people start listening.
Yeah. Thanks, Kerry, Lawrence.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Talk
Have
to
a
you
nice
soon.
weekend.
Have a good one.